Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time today. Today, we'll be going over part 3 of our 4-part series on PCI. This one is actually everything you need to maintain your PCI program. It will be led by Chris Donaldson, our PCI expert here at Risk 360. And before I pass it on to Chris, just a little housekeeping. If you have any questions, feel free to ask questions in the question section. And we also have 2 handouts that are connected to this presentation, and you should be able to download them in the handout section of the webinar screen. So thank you very much for joining us today. And Chris, you can take it on.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. So good, I guess it's afternoon where I am. Good afternoon to everyone. If it's not afternoon, and good morning. So as Corey said, this is part 3 of a 4-part series that we're doing with respect to PCI compliance. Today, we're going to be talking about maintenance of a PCI program. So on our journey, we started out with intro to PCI. 2 is, the second part was what do you need to know to get ready for a PCI assessment, and then now we're in the what do you need to do to maintain a compliant PCI program. So the assumption here is that on our journey in our story, our hero has completed their first year of PCI compliance. They passed their assessment. They have a completed either SAQ or report on compliance, and then a signed attestation of compliance from that they either signed or that their QSA signed. Now we're past it, right? So in terms of the agenda for today, I'm going to just go through a couple of things with y'all real quick. So number 1 is, why do organizations fall out of compliance, right? Like what happens after getting compliant? 2 is, what is best practices for maintaining compliance? I'm going to summarize a lot of it into some pretty actionable, like very concise, actionable steps, ways to think about your PCI program after that initial effort to get compliant in the first place. And then I'm going to share some accelerators and kind of talk you through some of the stuff that that Corey was alluding to a moment ago in terms of the handouts. I think that can really be beneficial to y'all in your programs long term. So without further ado, let's talk about why organizations fall out of compliance. So after an organization gets compliant, meaning that, as we were talking about, they did a big initial effort, rallied all the troops, put in a lot of time, deployed technologies, made updated configurations, changed processes, got the right people on the bus. Why do we see them in year 2 have a bunch of gaps when we come back to do their assessment? This happens for a couple of reasons, right? Number 1, a lot of our clients will have a very big product launch or a big priority that comes up, right? Meaning that the resources who were doing PCI compliance before devoted all their efforts, right? So say January 31st, they saw, their PCI compliant or ROC was issued or AOC was issued. In February, our new initiative, we're launching this new product, and so their lens, if they're on a compliance team or security team or engineering team, their entire world now is this new product and being able to get it out the door. We have a go live in October. We have a ton of work to do before then, and so PCI compliance just completely falls off their radar, right? They have completely new business goals. They have completely new structure. They may have a new person reporting over them. The technology stack has changed because of this new initiative or priority, what have you. PCI compliance gets run. The practices that they had built and worked so hard for in year 1 kind of get run over because everything they have this new thing that they're chasing after. Another reason is they get complacent after getting compliant. Organizations will assume that they're fine. After making it, they don't really have a plan for maintaining it. They just assume that it will get maintained. Or this third option, right, is they have overconfidence in their organizational practices, meaning individuals think that either because they got compliant in year 1 or they were compliant in year 1, that means they're going to be compliant in year 2, or that the practices that they have in place are going to be sufficient to maintain it without them ever maintaining those practices, right? So this idea they don't believe really in organizational entropy. They don't believe in compliance or security entropy, which anyone who's been around any sort of program in any way in security or having anything to do with compliance, you know that entropy, meaning the degradation of things over time without maintenance, is real and is very aggressive in some cases. Some organizations are going to have attrition, meaning that the key resource who was running the team, running the PCI compliance, they were responsible for making sure everything got done. They were responsible in a lot of cases for checking on to make sure the ASV scans got run or the internal scans got run. It's kind of built into their job. They leave or they change teams, right? They could even go from this team to another team internally, but just not have that responsibility anymore. And the PCI compliant or PCI program ceases to exist because there's no program in place. You had a person, but you didn't have a program. Another reason is things are just, out of sight, out of mind, right? If we're no longer working on it, if the assessor is no longer right here asking us for this stuff, we don't care. We have other things going on. And then the last reason, as I mentioned, was that entropy of entropy of scope, right? So rather than it being entropy of controls, it's entropy of scope, meaning that there was no due diligence, there was no process in place to adjust your PCI scope as your organization or as your company changes, right? So a lot of our clients are in the high growth, B2B SaaS space or high growth tech space, and as a part of that, every year an immense amount changes, right? The team grows, 25, 50%, sometimes more, right? The company grows in terms of revenue. They're going to add at least one product more often than not. They may do a big change. They may add in Azure in addition to their AWS presence because a particular client was looking for it. Right? But it's just the pace is fast. Consequence of that, if you don't actually haven't maintained PCI scope or don't have a program that maintains PCI scope, is that you're going to come around to your assessment the next year, and a bunch of things are going to be required to be PCI compliant that were not on your radar until today. So we do see that quite often, and specifically in our market that we work in. What that looks like on paper is this thing called the compliancy curve, and anybody who's done any sort of program, whether it be SOC 2 or ISO or your PCI or anything, right, over a period of time can relate to this. Pretty much in Q2, there's this immense, your project begins in Q1 and you're realizing that you have an immense amount to do, right? So, but not a ton really happens until your actual assessment starts, and then you get super compliant real fast. You stay compliant basically for the duration of the assessment, and then afterwards there begins this nice progressive decline back into non-compliance, which is where you kind of stay there until it's time for the next year, time for your assessment the next year, right? This is not specific to PCI. This is true of a lot of security compliance frameworks. So don't worry if this is you, if you found yourself in this position, you are not alone at all. So what can we do to mitigate this, right? Like what do we actually need to do, right? So number one, or what do we need to do in order for this not to be the case, for this not to be us, for it not to be the case that when my assessor comes on site in August, we have 20 new gaps when we just spent all of last year and a bunch of FTEs and a lot of money to get compliant in the first place, right? So number one is you have to have leadership buy-in, right? Leadership has to, when I say leadership, I mean CISO, I mean CIO, CTO, depending on how your organization is laid out, depending on what the reporting structure is, CRO in some cases. There has to be buy-in that maintaining PCI compliance is just as important as becoming PCI compliant in the first place. That PCI compliance is a business success metric. So that's number one, and that message has got to get pushed down from the top. Right? It can't be a bottom-up thing where you have engineers and you have product teams necessarily driving it. It's got to come from the top down, because everything else can get put into place if that's true. The next thing that has to happen is your security goals, specifically in this case, your PCI compliance goals, have to align to your business goals, meaning that PCI cannot be antithetical to your business objectives, or else you don't have a hope of maintaining any sort of compliance. In addition to that, PCI compliance should not be an entirely net new set of security controls for your organization. It should not be a new thing for your organization to harden systems, and you should not do it just because you need to be PCI compliant. Thirdly, you need to formalize your PCI program on paper. I would recommend, what this can be considered as is a PCI management operating system. If you don't know what a management operating system is, we'll get to that a little bit later. We have an accelerator for you that should help with some good thought leadership that Christian Hyatt, our CEO, has put out. But you need something on paper that formalizes your program, so that if anyone leaves, it's all that knowledge and all the practice is not left with them. Fourthly, you have to integrate PCI compliance into your normal security activities, right? So your PCI metrics need to be part of your security metrics, right? Which need to be part of your business, your overall success metrics. And then lastly, I'm just going to tell you, you need a tool. Like, you need a tool to manage and operate your PCI program in the same way that you need a tool to successfully manage and operate a security program, right? Excel is not, you can do it. It will be painful, and I have never seen it successfully maintained using Excel. I have not seen a PCI program at an organization, at least a medium-sized organization or greater, been maintained through Excel, or any other spreadsheet. You want to talk about, right? So you do need a tool. Shameless plug, for the GRC tool community, right? You need a tool because it's going to make the difference. Candidly, it's going to make your life easier, because you're only going to do as much on an ongoing basis as it is feasible for you to do in a day, right? Meaning that if it's going to be painful for you to maintain your program, you're not going to maintain it. So you take all of the pain out of the process and get something that automates a lot of it for you. I found a good quote. So a lot of the content, by the way, that we have today is based off of, I've adapted it quite a bit, but it's based off of a best practices document that the PCI DSS released in 2019, which not a lot of people know about, and probably fewer people have read. But there was a very good quote from, that was referenced in there that I went and pulled from Micro Focus that I will read to you, though it is on the screen. And it says, allowing the credit and forget it approach to drive security priorities is like cramming for an exam. You may pass the exam, or the audit in this case, but you're unlikely to retain any of the benefits you would have gained from careful study and planning, right? Passing an audit for PCI, for example, is a good achievement, but even PCI DSS, considered one of the most prescriptive mandates, is only a minimum standard of security and does not guarantee protection against data breaches, right? So if you only do PCI, you are still exposed. Your scope of exposure may just be a lot more limited for PCI specific risks. And for a lot of the folks a lot of the clients that we deal with in terms of being service providers, right, in the B2B space, their number one objective most of the time, right, is not necessarily PCI compliance. Their number one objective the number one security objective is otherwise. Hold on a second. Excuse me. So yeah, their number one objective is not PCI compliance. It's security. And PCI is a part of that, because they either they touch card data intentionally as a part of one of their processes, or part of one of their offerings to their customers, or it's incidental access based off of what their product does. So I'm going to share with you now some best practices for actually maintaining PCI compliance and talk through, ask you some questions, hopefully get you reflecting exactly on what, how your organization is approaching this, maybe get your wheels turning a little bit, right, for what you can do to be successful between assessment periods, right? So number one is developing and maintaining a sustainable security program, right? Sustainable security program, not one that's painful, not one that makes you, dread opening up, your metrics or opening up your document, or that's actually unattainable, right? This is where you have executives that are really setting the tone, that securing cardholder data, or the systems that can impact a customer's cardholder data is the goal, not just being PCI compliant, right? It's a mindset, not a single, not a point in time. And the goal is to minimize the presence of card data to the extent possible, right, with your program. Number two, and the first one's more strategic, right? It is strategic and it is integrated into, it's integrating PCI and the controls in PCI into your security approach in general, right? At least objectively. Number two is developing, the program, policies, and procedures for your PCI program. You have got to put your PCI operating system on paper, and you have to tell people. Like, people need to know about it, right? Having an analyst or having a manager writing down a document but not telling anybody is going to be wholly insufficient. Having that happen and having executives not back it up and support it and advocate for it is also, that's not going to cut it, right? So you have to have communication. You have to have, and it has to be formalized on paper. A great way of thinking about this is a PCI management operating system, right? Which is I talked about earlier. So there's a handout in the webinar. It's called Security Team Operating System. It's an ebook. Just to open it up for you a little bit, right? If you open it up, right, what you're really going to see is it's a workbook, right? It's a workbook that's going to show you the step-by-step of how to set up a management operating system, right? From defining your purpose to your culture and your core values, assigning responsibilities, defining meeting rhythms, and actually setting goals and key performance indicators. Putting all of that on paper and documenting it is an extremely progressive step to actually having your program survive from year to year to year without massive attrition or entropy, right? Number three is actually putting performance metrics to measure your PCI success, right? So I'll ask you the question, what data actually tells you your PCI program is working when you're not in the middle of an assessment, right? Like if your AOC date is January 31st, in 60 seconds, if it's July, in 60 seconds, how are you going to know if you're still compliant? What are you looking at? What data, not what person is telling you something, but what data are you looking at that confirms that you're still compliant, right? Do you have success metrics, such as, I have it on the slide, right? Percent of web servers that are hardened to a standard? Do you have a frequency of, PCI assets, or a count of PCI assets with a CrowdStrike agent on them, right? How many of them have a CrowdStrike agent on them, right? How much of your IT budget is actually devoted to information security, right? Do you have sufficient budget to maintain your program? All these things are super important that you really need to be thinking about. And if you don't, these should be built into that MOS, right? That last piece, that goals and KPIs, this is what we're talking about, right? And this should be built in. So part four, or I guess the fourth element, is assigning ownership. So assigning ownership specifically for coordinating the security activities, right? So number one, who's responsible for actually maintaining PCI compliance? Like, who's the person overall, right? And then for every one of your security activities, and we actually have an accelerator that's associated with this, which I'll get to towards the end. But do you have the individuals assigned to each of the security activities that you need to do? throughout the year, right? And how do you hold people or a person responsible for maintaining, one, a PCI compliant program, and two, maintaining those individual activity, or making sure those individual activities get done. For instance, who is the person that's responsible for making sure the semi-annual firewall rule set review gets accomplished? Who's responsible for making sure the ASV scans are, one, completed, two, don't have findings, and if they do, remediating them and then rescanning? Or who's responsible for scheduling the pen test? Who's responsible for running the risk assessment? Who's responsible for checking in on your your SDLC process to make sure your secure code scans are running and are being triaged accordingly? Who's responsible for making sure your WAF is working, right? So all these things need to be on paper. And without these things being on paper and being incorporated into your PCI MOS, like, I don't know how you maintain a program successfully. This is when we, as the assessor, walk in, I don't know if you're signing in January, we'll walk in maybe November and say, okay, great, show us your ASV scans, show us your internal scans, show us your pen testing report, show us your risk assessment. And the client's like, well, we had it from 2 years ago, right? This is our second year. I mean, and we know that you had it 2 years ago, but or last year, but you have nothing to show us this year, right? Because you did it once and you forgot about it. This happens all the time, and it can be very painful. It can be very frustrating as well, because there was a lot of effort expended in the previous year. Number 5, number 5 on the list is emphasizing security and risk management to attain and maintain compliance, right? So as we said earlier, PCI compliance does not equal security. In the same way that having like no problems or no nonconformities on your SOC 2 or what have you, or your ISO 27001 assessment, right, or having no gaps or problems there, doesn't necessarily mean you are secure, right? It just means that for that particular framework, there were no problems found. So organizations have to cultivate a culture of security, right? A culture of protecting your information assets, even in the absence of filing for PCI compliance in our case, right? I believe that PCI is a very robust framework. I think there's definitely a lot of gaps, right? One being in the scoping side of things obviously limits the amount of exposure that some organizations, specifically service providers, would extend their PCI compliance to scope to. But organizations do have to have a comprehensive view of their cyber risk, and they need to have a standardized controls framework. Like, there should be every organization should have a single set of security controls that they follow, which accomplish all of their compliance framework objectives. Meaning your SOC 2 controls are built into the framework, your PCI controls are built into the framework, your ISO 27001, 27002 are built into the framework, right? Anything else you may have is all built into there, right? You can base it off of NIST. You can base it off of a lot of different things, right? But you should have a single framework that supports your security objectives and also accomplishes your compliance objectives as a consequence of those overall security objectives being met. Then I guess next on the list is you need to continuously monitor security controls, right? So how do you do that without that single control framework? It's a heavy lift. So your MOS that you develop must have some sort of mechanism to actually get the data in on the security controls, right? Specifically, you need to be gathering throughout the year the evidence you need to actually file PCI compliance, right? So for all the controls that PCI has, there's quite a few of them that have a periodic element to them, right? Your risk assessment, scans, firewall reviews, things that changes, right? Things of that nature. Access control reviews. That evidence should be gathered throughout the year, so that by the time your assessment comes around, a lot of what you're doing is primarily just doing the observation and then maybe pulling configs for your assessor, you're not having to go find all the reports. You're not having to go find all the data for the things that were done throughout the year, right? You're essentially building your compliance case throughout the year rather than trying to go gather it all at once. For the goal that when your assessor comes on site, you can hand them a 50% solution or a 50% set of artifacts and reports, and then do walkthroughs and observation for the balance, right? Or pull specific things for the balance to prove compliance. This is a big one, right? So detecting and responding to security control failures. So we ask clients a lot. So service providers who do PCI, you'll know this already, but for those of you who are not service providers or haven't gone through PCI yet, there's a control in PCI that requires service providers specifically to monitor for critical security control failures. So what does that mean? So I'll ask, first question is, what are all the critical security controls that you have, right? Firewalls, web application firewall. It can be an IDS, IPS. It can be your logs, right? Like there's probably a laundry list. Your network access control lists, or your security groups, or VLAN. Pardon me. Like your ACLs in your cloud environments, right? Those all count. So I'll ask you, how would you know how long would it take for you to find out if any one of them was not working as intended, right? If your for instance, if logs from a specific EC2 instance or from your Kubernetes cluster, your master node, we're not going to CloudWatch anymore, or we're not going to Splunk or Alien Vault or whatever. If those indexes weren't working anymore or stopped flowing, how long would it take you to realize that you don't have logs from those sources? Like, how long would it take you to realize that you're no longer getting AV logs? How long would it take you to realize that your wireless scanner wasn't scanning? How long would it take you to realize that you actually didn't do an internal quality scan for the past 2 months, right? Because there was an issue, or it ran, but it didn't actually give you the coverage of all the assets that you needed, right? It gave you 90% for the past 2 quarters, but you just didn't know, right? How long would it take you to find out? For a lot of our clients, they find out when we do the assessment. When we open up things and we see, okay, hey, it looks like your scans failed in this month, and they continued to fail. Oh, a firewall rule was put in to block traffic. Okay. So they actually couldn't get in for an internal scan. They just don't know, right? So, what do you have in place to actually to help alert you when a critical security control fails? Either on the a critical detective control, a critical preventative control, right? Like, how long would it take you to find out? And do you have a process in place if such a failure were to occur, right? So if you did find out that your WAF has not actually been, the rules got messed up and were, somehow, and your WAF has been non-functional for the past 2 months, like it's just been passing all the traffic through, right? It hasn't been blocking anything. What would you do? Do you have a response plan for that? Who needs to be involved? Is there any due diligence that needs to happen to make sure that there was no breach during that time, that there was no anomalous activity during that time, because the security control you were relying on was not actually working? So what do you do? And do you have that on paper? Moving on, so number 8, we have maintaining security awareness. So everyone knows that there's a control in PCI for maintaining a security awareness program. But what I will encourage you to do is to not let this be a check the box exercise. One, because we still to this day see that people are the weakest link when it comes to security, that social engineering still continues to work and still continues to be effective, though many organizations, I would say most organizations that I'm aware of, do security awareness training, right? Why does it fail, right? Well, one, we don't see a lot of organizations continuing to update their security awareness trainings to accommodate and to consider the most recent threat vectors and trends with respect to data breaches, with respect to what's happening in the environment. And what ends up happening is individuals are fatigued. You yourself may be fatigued and may just click through your security awareness training, right? Or you don't particularly pay attention during your annual security awareness training meeting or webinar or what have you that goes on. And that fatigue results in social engineering attacks being successful. Because even if you had, you may have brought something up, but at that point it's just so, you've heard it so many times you no longer hear it anymore, if that makes sense. And the repetitiveness really degrades people's attentiveness to security. If you continue to send out the same, phishing campaign, right, internally, it's the same kind of email, people get a false sense of security that they know that they can protect against phishing attacks when there's a whole new set of phishing campaigns or kinds of phishing campaigns that are coming out that you have not exposed your employees to. Number 9 is monitoring the compliance of your third-party service providers. I will call these CPSTs, but that's what we're talking about. So number 1, and PCI requires this, but really for the sake of your own sanity, maintain a list of what PCI requirements you are relying on your service providers to be compliant for. AWS and Azure are going to cover a decent amount, but that's a good list to maintain, because it's going to help you figure out where you actually have responsibility. And 2, it's going to help you figure out when you do your due diligence process, the second one, what you actually need to assess them against and what you need to be looking for. And I'll reiterate, please perform regular due diligence on your third-party service providers to make sure they're holding up their end of the deal, right? To make sure they're actually doing what you're expecting them to do. And this is a requirement from PCI anyway, but we do see it done, but it's just done ad hoc. There tends to be not an immense amount of focus put on this. So I would encourage you to just build this into your third-party risk management process. And then the last one is to evolve your compliance program to address changes, right? So everyone knows that things are not static, and this was the first point we mentioned way back at the beginning of the presentation for reasons that organizations fall out of compliance, is because they don't evolve, right? So your PCI compliance program should evolve as your security program evolves and as your business objectives evolve, right? Your PCI, like what's in scope evolves, what threats you're trying to protect against, those evolve. Your organizational structure evolves. The goals that the business is shooting at, those evolve. Processes and technologies, and things are constantly changing, especially within like this market of high growth B2B SaaS providers. So like lean into it and assume that you need to pay a lot more attention to your PCI program, a lot more attention to your security program, because things are constantly changing, right? So to sum it all up and to maybe put everything on one page, right? Here's what I put to you, right? If I'm your QSA and it's the last day of our assessment, right? We just gave you the rock, we're doing our readout meeting. Here's what I'm gonna tell you. Number 1 is make PCI compliance part of your security program, right? Nothing in PCI, or rather there's really one requirement in PCI, and it's not even that, which should be specific to PCI. That's the data protection stuff. Everything else is security best practice, right? Hardening your network, hardening your systems, encrypting internet-based traffic, right? Those channels, deploying antivirus, secure SDLC, least privilege, access controls, logging, monitoring, physical security, a security program. All of those things you should be doing anyway. Like you should be doing those things regardless of its PCI compliance or any other framework, because that's what it takes to actually maintain a secure organization, right? So don't make PCI special. PCI should be a part of your normal security controls that you implement. Number 2 is make that PCI management operating system, right? Where you have on paper here's the vision, here's the mission, here's how we're going to talk about culture, here's acceptable behavior, here's our meeting cadences, here's how we're going to handle all these activities, and here's what success looks like. Here's our goals, and here's what our KPIs are. Number 3 is get everyone on the bus. Put all those people in the right seats and then over communicate, right? Make sure you have the right individuals in the right spots doing the right things, and make sure they're supported, over supported, right? Put your compliance program into a tool. You're doing a lot of extra work and not getting any, you don't get extra credit for running your PCI program out of Excel. And there are cost-effective options for moving your PCI program into a tool, right? So I really, really recommend you explore those options. It will greatly behoove you. Number 5, just define success and metrics, right? And really use those metrics to hold people accountable. And the last one is to periodically, reassess your program against the overall security and business goals, right? As your environment changes and as the threat landscape changes. As you mentioned, making sure, redoing the risk assessment and saying, okay, hey, these systems actually need AV on them or AM on them now, or EDR, or what we're going to say, right? These systems are no longer safe. So we need to do something different, right? Regardless if a PCI comes out with a new standard or a new control or rephrases something or clarifies something in a blog post or in an FAQ, we should do it because that's what the threat landscape demands of us. Hey, we added on a whole new business. We're not going to wait for the audit to come around to tell us that that business needs to be compliant. We added a new product. We're not going to wait for, a customer to ask us necessarily if, we have PCI compliance for that product. Even though we've been doing PCI compliance for everything else, we're going to go ahead and at least do some due diligence there, right? So evolve your PCI program as your company evolves, as the threat landscape evolves. So that's the bow on the how to actually maintain a program. There's a lot of specifics that I'll talk about the accelerators now. So number 1, this initial accelerator, it's, as I said, it's linked in the handout. But Christian Hyatt, our CEO, put together a very good workbook for what's called the security MOS, right? I would adopt it in this case for PCI purposes and say, you can use the same principles for a PCI management operating system, right? Actually, it should be a subset of your security operating system, right? This is a good workbook. It's going to go through some really good exercises, right? It's going to go through a delegate and elevate activity. Highly recommend anyone, one, for your security program to do this, but 2, for your PCI program to do this as well, at least do a lot of the exercises. So you can put on paper what your PCI program needs to look like to maintain it. Because I want you to keep all the efficiencies, I want you to keep all the success you had from your first year into subsequent years without having to reinvest in technology, having to reinvest in FTEs or process updates, right? And then the last accelerator we have here, the last accelerator we have here is an Excel file, right? And it's called How to Maintain a PCI Program, Program Accelerator version 1.0. There's 3 different tabs in this spreadsheet, right? Number 1 is going to be essentially a roles and responsibilities tab. What it's going to say is, okay, it's a bunch of example items, right? A bunch of example teams, right? So for instance, your access control admins, right? It's going to say, here's what this role does, right? Here's the responsibility of this role. Here's what the activities they're roughly responsible for. And then it's going to have an opportunity for you in that 3rd column to list the key contact from that team. So Jiminy Cricket on the access control admins is the person that we would talk to specifically around these sorts of activities. For the 2nd tab, what you're going to find is essentially a mapping of all of your assets, all of your information assets in the Y axis in all the PCI controls in the excuse me, in the x-axis across the top. So this exercise is extremely helpful for actually identifying what things in PCI do these information systems or assets need to be responsible for? Do these people need to be responsible for? Obviously adapt it. We just did a brief, took a shot at it for maybe a cloud environment, right? Some of the information also is pulled from an appendix from this exact document that we were referencing in a lot of the presentation. So encourage y'all to download this and adapt it for your own use, put it on your Confluence page, whatever you want to do with it, right? Put it in your own SharePoint. And then the last one is at the bottom here, and this is probably the biggest, most impactful piece of all the accelerators that were uploaded, right? And this also comes from that same document. But what it has is the daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, and annually activities that you need to do to maintain a PCI compliant PCI program. It's going to have the control associated with it, the title. It's going to have the guidance on specifically what needs to happen, and where you have the opportunity to do, and the template is to identify, okay, what team is going to be doing this, right? And who is the responsible contact from that team if it's different than the key contact listed in that first tab. There is some formula. There's some data validation and formulas built into it. So if you pick, for instance, the access control team and you've picked Jiminy Cricket as the person from that access control team who's responsible, Jiminy's name will show up in that responsible contact column. You obviously can change it. It's going to show, and it's going to allow you to talk about status as well as due date, right? So again, great opportunity just in terms of Excel to just get things off the ground, right? To build, to at least stand something up that you can then migrate into a tool later, right? But this is the initial step if you have nothing to begin with. Highly recommend, these. I think that they will give you a leg up if you're starting from the ground floor, to at least help put some structure around thinking about your PCI program from a maintenance perspective. So with that, what we'll do is we'll talk, just to cite, that's the end of the content that we have. We'll take questions in a moment. As a shout out, we're taking November off, but in December we will have another webinar, which is a simplified review of the PCI data security standard in plain English. This will go through, all the things that you need to know about the current version 3.2.1 of the DSS in terms of principles, what to expect from your assessor, and so on and so forth. We'll try to cover as much as we can in about 45 minutes. And then we'll obviously have subsequent information coming out later in 2023 that everyone can leverage. But just as a sneak peek, that's what we're working on for December.